Imagine this. You have poets separated by thousands of miles of ocean, living in completely different political worlds. Yet somehow, they found a way to share their work, to connect. Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating historical puzzle that links poets across the South China Sea, all through the power of the written word.
So here's the big question that kicks this whole thing off. In the really turbulent years after World War II, when borders were being redrawn and people were figuring out who they were, what on earth would drive a poet from, say, Singapore or Malaya to send their poems all the way to one specific journal in Taiwan? I mean, it just sounds kind of strange, doesn't it? Let's figure out why they did it.
All right, so how do we even begin to crack a mystery like this? Well, the answer, and this is pretty cool, it comes from a single academic research paper. This paper is our key, the document that lets us piece this whole incredible story together.
Okay, so this paper by Li Chih-Hao zooms right in on this one journal called the Chinese Poetry Court. And it looks at a very specific 12-year window from 1955 to 1967. You can think of this journal as the meeting point, the place where all the different threads of our story come together. It's basically the X that marks the spot on our historical treasure map.
And here's the thing you've got to understand. This was not just a simple business deal. The poets in Singapore and Malaysia weren't just, looking for anyone who would print their stuff. No, they were looking for something much, much deeper. They were searching for a connection, for a sense of belonging in a world that had been totally turned upside down. To really get what was driving them, we need to kind of zoom out and look at the world they were living in. The mid-20th century was an absolute pressure cooker of change and division, especially in Asia. Just a quick glance at the timeline shows you how chaotic these years really were. Just look at this chain of events. World War II ends in 45. Then, boom, just a few years later in 49, the Chinese Civil War leads to the Republic of China government moving to Taiwan. That one event basically split the Chinese-speaking world in two. And right in the middle of all that, in 55, our journal is born. At the very same time, Malaya and Singapore are on their own journeys, breaking free from Britain to build brand new countries. This context, well, it's everything.
So all of this history created two completely different realities for Chinese communities. On one side, you have what's happening in Taiwan, and on the other, you've got the diaspora communities in places that would soon become Singapore and Malaysia.
And this chart just lays out the contrast perfectly. Taiwan, under the ROC, saw itself as the sole guardian of traditional Chinese culture. Its whole mission was preservation. But for the Chinese communities in Singapore and Malaysia, it was a totally different ballgame. They were now part of these new multi-ethnic nations, and they had to figure out, okay, how does our Chinese heritage fit into this new identity we're building? Two very different questions. So you have these two communities on such different paths, with different priorities. You got to ask, what could possibly link them together in a meaningful way? Well, the answer wasn't going to be political. It had to be cultural. And this is where our journal comes strolling back into the story. It wasn't just paper and ink, you see. It became this vital bridge spanning a massive political and geographical divide. The Chinese Poetry Court. Its mission was incredibly specific. It was all about celebrating and publishing classical Chinese poetry. And that focus on tradition, on a shared artistic heritage that went back centuries, that was exactly the anchor that poets in the diaspora were looking for. Now, what's so fascinating is how this journal evolved. It wasn't just a mailbox for poems. It became this active, buzzing cultural hub. It was like a virtual town square for writers who felt culturally cut off and desperately wanted to connect back to the heartland of their literary tradition. This quote just nails it. Think about it. In a world before the internet, before you could just hop on a video call, a single, specialized little journal could act as the connective tissue for a community spread all across the sea. It was the thread that kept a shared cultural identity alive and breathing. So we've kind of cracked the case, right? But what's the bigger takeaway here? Why should we care about this little cross-sea poetic connection from more than 60 years ago? Well, for starters, this whole story pulls back the curtain on this hidden cultural network that was humming along right under the surface of Cold War politics. While governments were busy drawing lines on maps, these poets were drawing lines of connection. It also shows us Taiwan's early role as a center of cultural soft power, using shared heritage, not force, to connect with people. But maybe the biggest lesson here is that art has its own passport. It just leaps over political fences and reminds us that our identity is always so much more complex than just a single nationality. So really, by zooming in on this one little journal, we get a much clearer picture of those invisible forces:
culture, identity, politics that are always shaping our world. It's a story about how real people use art to find their place in history, to build communities, and to make sense of who they are.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. In our world of social media and instant everything, what are the modern versions of the Chinese poetry court? What are those invisible cultural bridges? The niche blogs, the online forums, the shared fandoms that connect scattered communities all over the world today. It's something to chew on, for sure.